I'm Ben Bowles from LSE, this is Professor Laura Beck, also from LSE, and this is our cruise pilot project. So, we've been tasked by the CCS at the Cabinet Office to give them some advice and part of their review of making infrastructure resilient by design. Resilience as a term has had this kind of strange travel, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, actually. This is the first thing that we found when looking at it. But fundamentally, there's two things in resilience that are always constant. It's about accepting that parts of systems are affected by all other things. So people call this a systems of systems approach or a network of network approach. And so you accept that change is endemic and you can't really tell what's going to happen, right? And therefore, number two, resilience involves being able to cope with this uncertainty and volatility. And so that might be resisting those shocks, or it might be being able to get back on your feet and get running after they happen. Okay? Fundamentally, though, the thing that links those things is it's about whether in infrastructure we are thinking about all the things that may affect the infrastructure and make it more secure in the environment. So, are we thinking beyond the asset, right? With that in mind, I'm trying to answer three questions. One, how does infrastructure get built? Because actually it's a lot more complicated than some of the processes that are there on paper. Two, do the people who are building it think with this resilience perspective? You know, how much does it percolate in? Do they call it resilience and is it there? And three, how do you intervene to change that? So that's the bit which is obviously most cruise focused, I think. The best way for me to do this, I think, is to give you an overview of what we've done and what we're going to recommend. And so this is a kind of a draft version of what we're going to be giving back to the Cabinet Office. So it's lovely to see Elizabeth Weston here, who is one of the people that I'll be presenting this to, and so she can help to shape it at this feedback stage. So this starts off a bit practical in terms of the findings that we found when we were in the field, but then it gets cruisier when we talk about the recommendations for intervention. First though, I do want to give it cruise framing and spell out how this is about cruise. So, when we're talking about decision makers, we've got really two constituencies of decision makers here. The first is these guys at the CCS in the Cabinet Office deciding where and how to intervene in infrastructure. And the way that I see it, we can help them to do two things using cruise perspective. We can encourage the decision makers to examine conventional decisions about potential sites and style of intervention. We can also demonstrate the existing role of both things like conviction narratives from powerful actors and also these kind of technological non-human actors that come together to create infrastructure projects. Because infrastructure projects kind of may look afterwards like they were somebody's idea, but quite often there's a lot of processes and synchronicities and things that come into being in order to get them off the ground and happening. Of course, there's a second constituency, though. There's the people who are deciding where to build infrastructure and what to build. So we can demonstrate that a lot of decision-making around infrastructure is part of cost-benefit analysis, and it's produced, therefore, from a sort of optimization-based quantitative models that we're hearing a lot about yesterday, that simply don't reckon these kind of larger system effects. I was talking to an economist the other day who was talking about how it's almost a case of micro versus macro economics, where these system effects aren't put into it. We can also suggest to them as well that expert and informed judgment based on experience and good process, like we were talking about yesterday, making the processes good because there can't be any sort of right and wrong decisions, can be successfully used as a method of assessing project viability. And actually this has some real advantages over just having one model and that's it, right? And as social anthropologists, I think we add something to CRUISSE which is quite specific, which is that we're able to sort of draw out the geography of these complex social and technological systems that make up something like the infrastructure pipeline. And also we're able to do sort of archaeologies of terms like resilience and go into what it means and where it's travelled from and how it's changed its meaning. So that's our sort of specific angle on cruise, I think, as people from social anthropology. So, with that in mind, this is roughly what our report to the Cabinet Office is going to look like. And I'm going to talk to you about the bits which aren't greyed out. So I decided to kind of leave a little bit of this for later and talk to you about the most important bits of the findings. So I'm just just going to plough straight into this. As I say, this gets more kind of CRUISSE focused as we get beyond the findings and into the recommendations, I think, potentially. So, the Cabinet Office are doing this. They are maintaining, they are trying to make infrastructure resilient to hazards, design for reliability. They want to contain redundancy, and they want to plan a response and recovery element into infrastructure. So anything that can do that is going to be important. And they also want to look at the role of things like cost-benefit analysis in Treasury Green Book spending team review and in the IPA. So our role within that, we said that we do these 7 things for them, and hopefully this report shows that we've done at least a few of them. We want to outline the current barriers to the application of resilient standards, recommend ways to intervene in decision-making around infrastructure so as to overcome some of those barriers, propose a standards framework that would support long-term decision-making about resilience goals. Sorry, I'm just reading from the slide, but these are the important things we're trying to do. Advise on how regularly to review this framework to keep it reflexive, and I think that's really important from a CRUISSE perspective. How do you do that, and what does reflexive mean? Recommend how and where it would be most effective to apply these standards in the pipeline. I kind of start there actually because it's a good place to start and then go out from it. And also challenge the assumptions that all infrastructures need the same standards regime, because they don't necessarily, right? And generally challenge this one-size-fits-all approach around infrastructure. So what we did was this, 23 and counting semi-structured interviews with lots of different groups from engineers, policy makers. We did actually manage to talk to Treasury, IPA, in order to see what these processes were and how they've experienced things like the Treasury spending team reviews and IPA assurance. And we really went in deep with a couple of case studies. The HS2 one is still in progress, but Thames Tideway we've had a lot of conversations with, and they've been quite good with their access for us. We also deep delved the literature, of course, and we were able to be at a meeting between Thames Tideway and DEFRA with all of the other bodies there, the regulators, so Thames Water and Ofwat, in order to see quite how they interacted, which was really very useful for seeing how infrastructure actually gets off the ground and what happens in these processes. And I'm actually going to start with that Thames Tideway example and kind of show how from one infrastructure project, lots of the themes and findings that we had came up out of that one thing. So Thames Tideway is this, in a way, quite new model of infrastructure project. It's this kind of massive piece of engineering, building a great big sewer, effectively, all the way along the Thames through London. And it's the kind of engineering on a grand scale. The company that runs it is called Bazalgette, quite deliberately. It's connecting up with the kind of history of Grand Victorian engineering. It's very, in fact, somebody at the DEFRA meeting said that they'd come on quite sceptical and had become intoxicated by the power of grand engineering projects, which I thought was fascinating. And we can learn at least 5, I think, interesting things out of Tideway itself as an example. First of all, major infrastructure, if it doesn't receive this direct government funding, can be moved from Treasury and IPA assurance into this kind of ministerial approval kind of phase. And I didn't really know what that meant because it's not formalised in the same way as Treasury and IPA assurance. And so in this case it was DEFRA. This leads on to 2, kind of like what was this kind of ministerial overview. In this case, it's quite reliant on external audit. And in fact the external auditor's role in this DEFRA liaison was to kind of go, you know what the Chief Operating Officer said, yeah, we pretty much don't have anything to add to that. So it's very internal, it's project focused and relatively insular, and it looks at the potential kind of progress of the project against its cost more than it looks at other kind of wider concerns, which was absolutely fascinating for us. And then there's these other revelations that come out of it, like for example, the this relatively novel financial structure of something like Tideway means that it can raise funds from all these places like pension providers, which is very, very interesting, and the government's been talking for a while about how that would be useful. But the government acts as an insurer of last resort, meaning that if the project goes wrong, then there's actually quite a lot of risk associated. And so I think that's interesting for example, the Cabinet Office to be thinking about whether the government might hold risk without potential benefit from large infrastructure. Also, it demonstrates some of the drivers that we're going to be talking about, which aren't these kind of, we've decided strategically to build something drivers, which quite often end up in the narratives. For example, in this case, the ecological case of a polluted river and the threat of litigation, which led to tideway becoming an option that was mooted in the first place. And lastly, I guess some of these look a little critical, and this last one is really a positive one. Very positive indeed. They're kind of social resilience model, or what we're going to call social resilience, of kind of involving communities at an early stage, front-loading the benefits to those communities and engaging with their stakeholders. In fact, in cases, overcompensating, giving too much, or what is more than the market price to the people who are going to be affected, has led to what was a very unpopular project in the places where it was going, becoming sort of this good neighbour, as they describe themselves, to the localities in which it finds itself. And I think that's an interesting model which tells you something actually about resilience, even though it may not look like resilience from the outset. So, first of all, I guess it's more like third of all now. But but we found that a lot of people were talking quite differently about resilience, and I wanted to really outline kind of what people meant by this term. And physical resilience, kind of the ability for something to stand up in a built environment, is only one of the types of resilience that I found these experts talking about. I've kind of put it into 5 categories, and this is massively open for discussion, and I'll really, take your comments on board if you think I missed something out. But I think that this physical resilience in built environment, including what stuff is made out of and its vulnerability to particular shocks, is one way of conceiving resilience, and we've got at least 4 other things going on. They are broader environmental resilience, which can quite often get left out of the practicalities of these discussions. The financial resilience of a project, its financing and the health of that financing, which I think is important over the project's life scale, okay? And what that financing structure is doing to people. The political resilience of the asset, whether it's going to be supportable and supported all the way through its trajectory and all the way through its life. Is it going to become a rather different beast by the time different ministers have come and gone from a project, by the time it's gone through a couple of election cycles? HS2 may be an interesting example to talk about. Social resilience is the other one, which is it the resilience that communities can understand, want, can value, can know what to do with, and all of these other things? Is it the infrastructure that will meet their eventual needs? So it's possible to get, with your CRUISSE hats on, you guys, you'll be recognising that it might be possible to get good kind of experience and intuition for lots of these kinds of resilience from the experts. But you can't model all of these with any degree of accuracy. You certainly can't build one kind of big resilience model out of them. And so that's a prime part of our argument. One of the things that the Cabinet Office was quite keen on us to do was kind of draw out what the infrastructure life cycle looked at. And so, I'm sorry, model land, but I drew a model and I apologise for it. And like all models, it's an imperfect thing. I do apologise, yeah. And this is what I've come up with, and it kind of shows that it shows a couple of things. One, that the drivers for infrastructure are kind of multiple, and I don't think I've even managed to list them all here. And quite often it's a confluence of drivers that result in infrastructure being built. The design stage of infrastructure is, again, this kind of multifactorial process in which particular departments have to build these business cases in order to get a thing off the ground. The things that go into building those business cases themselves are sort of multiple. So the senior responsible officers in departments, and there's this thing called CRO churn, which is the way that successful CROs who are capable to get projects going are moved from project to project, sometimes outside of their sectors, build these cases in a way that's already quite disciplined to what they think the Treasury and IPA are going to be looking for. Right? And there's a big role in this of external audit and also of external training companies who train SROs in order to tell them basically how to build business cases. There's also a whole world of infrastructure which is below kind of department discretionary levels, which gets built without it becoming part of Treasury assurance or treasury spending team or IPA assurance. Sorry if I'm going off into the weeds with this, but it really is an interesting picture, I think. Then there's a variety of different assurance structures. And I've outlined the one that I think is possibly the best site of intervention for standards that will actually shape what infrastructure looks like. That's the strategic business case stage. Because by the time that projects get to outline business case, there's a short list of projects, and resilience, as in where it fits into the broader picture, is to a greater or lesser degree taken out of it. I think that's a really vital point out of this. Okay. Another thing to say about this is it's a bit of an iceberg, right? I've drawn a line there. All of this stuff above the line is perhaps the most visible bits, but most assets, most infrastructure is out there in the world. And the value in infrastructure spend annexed to the Green Book says this quite explicitly, that small spends to existing infrastructure and maintaining them in the right way can actually create great benefit from low cost. And actually, if we concentrate all on the new build stuff, we're missing out most of the infrastructure that exists in systems. So there's also, as I say, a sort of iceberg effect that sits here as well. Okay? Now, those barriers to resilience that I was talking about. Here's my top 8. Again, if I've missed any, you can please let me know, because we're trying to build, as far as possible, this big complicated picture of infrastructure and what it looks like. The 8 barriers that I've identified: legibility. Okay, so can the government see it from their point of view? You know, or is it built by private providers? Is it below a department's discretionary spending? Do large overview government departments have the ability to see it and affect it? Strategy. Is there what kind of strategic overview has led to the building of this thing, or has it been, as I say, a confluence of various different things coming together at a particular time, or ministerial intervention, kind of minister's push to make something happen? The way that lots of this happens in silos. Governments with their own budgets, government departments with their own budgets, but also governmental spending teams that are largely siloed to look at, for example, health spending, education spending, transport spending. The role of cost-benefit analysis. Does this value resilience? The argument, I think, is no. Whether that means no cost-benefit analysis or doing something on top of cost-benefit analysis is the big question we haven't answered yet, I think, actually. I'm not going to try to put an answer on that one. This stuff I've talked about already, the disciplining of builds. So by the time that it reaches assurance, how have people been disciplined to produce certain kinds of business cases that look a certain way? What is the role of external auditing and training companies in that? The kind of univocality of the people who are looking at this, there's a lot of economists who do so, and economist knowledge is very important. But are there other kinds of experts? Engineers are relatively included in some parts of this process. I don't think even the engineers are represented enough, really. And also certain other kinds of networks aren't. Miles is shaking his head as an engineer who hasn't been included, I think. Inclusion, okay. So how many of these processes are visible, even to other parts of government, is a big question. Certainly Treasury spending teams don't like to tell you about the actual process of Treasury spend review. Okay? And learning and evaluating from good projects. I talked to a couple of people from the Treasury who said, you know, everybody here is quite young, then they turn over and move to something else, from spending team to spending team. How do you keep institutional knowledge? How do you keep lessons learned? Apparently there's this database of kind of lessons learned practices. How do these actually get shared and formulated? On potential sites of intervention, please do read the key finding at the top, which says that I think that a good standards regime for infrastructure tries to shape more than one of these places. But if it has to do one thing, it has to pick a strategic place to intervene. I think that the making strategic business cases resilient to design would be an excellent way of doing that. I think that would be a location that if these SBCs were assessed for resilience in order to pass through to the next stage, that you could, in one hit, affect a lot of the things down the line. You could kind of cascade a lot of the good work downwards. So, okay, after that, we do a whole bunch of other things. As I say, I'm leaving them out of the report now because I've already probably talked too much. But then how do you what kind of standards are we recommending then? And this is kind of where it gets cruisier. What should these standards be? Well, we in a way, and I think that Tobias said this yesterday, and it was really, really interesting, we shouldn't tell people what to do necessarily, we shouldn't tell them how to design systems. But I think we should probably say that whatever the systems that come out, they should be these 5 things. These are the ones that I've come up with. Again, please, if you want to put other things in the box, I would really like to hear about them. I think that they need to be reflexive. And by that, we mean that standards should be able to look at the choices that they make and how they're making them, and then be able to learn from them. There's various different ways of doing that, including kind of hardwiring the evidence and learning into standards so that they have to reflect on past choices that have been made and whether they're built on the right processes or not. They have to be adaptive to new concerns and new things happening. So you need to make sure that you assess what kind of resilience and what standard of resilience is important in given cases, because as I say, there's probably not one such thing as resilience. Okay? And the more you follow the literature through, the more you get this impression. They should be non-reductive, they shouldn't just try to quantify everything. And there are a lot of people in this discussion who want there to be quantifiable resilience variables so that they can affect cost-benefit analysis decisions in order to make it easier to fund particular pieces of infrastructure by saying, oh, it's got this resilience benefit that you can add to the value side, right? That's a thing which may be potentially useful. I don't think that you can try to do that with all variables and then end up with something that's coherent, because quite often they'll become subsumed by the cost-benefit analysis processes. Would be my argument. Please feel free to argue against it. I think that these should be evidence-led and democratic, both, meaning that they should contain experts and people in them, ideally. And I think they should be multivocal. I think you should have people from different disciplines sitting on whatever standards these are, because as I say, at the moment there's, relatively speaking, a univocality of people who end up doing this stuff. So that's what we think that they should be, whatever they are. Design them in whatever way you look, but I think that they should probably be these things. So our radical suggestion, which is maybe too radical, looks a bit like this. Expert panels made up of various different experts in different kinds of resilience, right? May be brought down to somebody who thinks about political resilience, somebody who thinks about financial resilience, somebody who thinks about social resilience, coming together. Expert engineers who think about physical resilience, climate scientists, really important, right? Informing citizens' juries who can tell you kind of how much resilience and what kind of resilience they need for whatever's getting built in their area. Give them good options, because as I'll say in a minute, my kind of last point is that infrastructure builds involve quite often a lot of trade-off, and therefore the people who invested in it have to be able to decide on that trade-off. We heard this from somebody from the Environment Agency, I think, yesterday, who was saying that, you know, some people, if the only way to protect them from flooding is to build a 10-foot wall through their village, they may not want the 10-foot wall. Therefore, talking to people about the 10-foot wall is incredibly important. Right, but this applies, I think, to infrastructure more outside of flooding. And I think that these things, these expert panels talking to citizens' juries, can set resilience priorities and minimum expectations for resilience on projects. Whether you put that alongside cost-benefit analysis, find a way of, or do something else with it, I don't know, but my vision would be finding a way of coding, as I say, set minimum expectations for resilience and the resilience priorities of communities, and these have to be assessed alongside the strategic business case. This would, in a way, get you out of this discussion about cost-benefit analysis, at least for now, but I'm sure there's a broader discussion to be had about that, and about the Green Book in general. Right. So these are some brief suggestions. I'm not going to just read off of a slide about how you do work in order to keep all of those 5 points that I made going. And okay, fine. It's a report, and I'm sorry, too much to read. But these are some of the reasons why we've recommended using kind of CRUISSE ways of thinking of these kind of interventions and what they look at. As I say, there's a community role in deciding priorities and trade-offs. There's a recognition and a growing recognition that Green Book thinking does not capture value that's calculable in the traditional sense. We get this out of the Institute for Governance How to Value Infrastructure report, out of the Green Book's Value and Infrastructure Spend Annex from 2015. Looking at how that's actually applied in reality is actually really important, and it would be really interesting to be able to spend some more time with Treasury spending teams, but it's incredibly difficult. There's political benefit as well for involving people in decisions. So you can see that out of the Republic of Ireland's recent abortion referendum, and how the use of citizens' juries in order to inform the question led to this kind of widespread political advantages for decision makers. There's obviously CRUISSE things you'll be familiar with, so I'm not going to go over the same ground. The role of expert decision makers under conditions of uncertainty, and a growing recognition I think we have here that making choices based upon good processes and then reviewing them is better than trying to quantifiable measures. Right. And also a kind of a cross-sectoral move towards valuing expert panels and also citizen involvement. And so we can think about, for example, the Royal Academy of Engineers, Internet of Things recommendations, Bank of England as well recommending the use of citizens' juries. So these are a summary of the recommendations. So where I'm going to leave you with this is kind of on, obviously I'm going to be encouraging questions from you, but also there's this which I think is interesting. Again, slides filled with too much text, but you know, I'm going to leave this up here for a minute. Over there on your left, there's the things that we think make up the processes by which people value infrastructure. And this is the kind of looking at it from the outside, what are people applying picture, which is, you know, Green Book, Magenta Book, Orange Book. These are the things that spending teams apparently apply all of in order to make all infrastructure go through the same processes and be standardised. Versus kind of on the right, when you actually talk to people from spending teams, what questions are they actually asking of infrastructure? Well, they actually have this kind of one-page sheet which contains a summary, a kind of a tick box-like summary of the things that they're looking for. And because, you know, nobody's going to be able to apply the several hundred pages of Green Book, Magenta Book and Orange Book to everything. So what's really important is to actually look at recognise that we're talking about human decision makers, understand who they are, and in this case it's, as I say, spending teams. Looking at the makeup of those and their relatively hidden character is important, and then looking at how they're kind of selectively, in this way on the right, applying the stuff on the left. I think that's really, really interesting. Okay, that's what I'm going to leave you with. Thank you very much. Goodbye.